Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Fully Booked Chats. For today's conversation, we are joined by Professor Connson Locke, author of Making Your Voice Heard, and our host, Jen Horn. Together, we will discuss Professor Locke's new book and talk about the ways in which we can communicate more confidently and effectively in all settings. Jen Horn is a learning facilitator, researcher, and writer who plants seeds for reconnection and regeneration. She is a certified transformational coach working primarily with women in the social enterprise and nonprofit sector. She is currently designing a program with Haraya Coaching to support corporations in adopting mindsets that can aid in creating more impactful goals, strategies, and practices. She is a sustainability lecturer at the Leadership and Strategy Department of Ateneo de Manila University and completed her MSc in Sustainable Development from the University of Surrey. Her research focused on developing a framework for understanding the personal motivations of sustainability leaders in the Philippines. She is also a founder of Mooney, a community that holds space for reflection and conversation for a more mindful, equitable, and livable world. She too is the host of the Mooney on This podcast, of which I'm a fan of. Professor Connson Locke joined the London School of Economics in 2008, where she teaches leadership, organizational behavior, and negotiation and decision making. She has over 30 years of experience as an educator, coach, and consultant, working in Europe, Asia Pacific, North America, and Australia. Prior to entering academia, she served as regional training and development manager for the Boston Consulting Group, where she was responsible for the learning and development of consulting staff in 10 offices across Asia Pacific. Connson holds a PhD and MSc in Business Administration, Organizational Behavior from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in Sociology from Harvard, where she graduated with honors. Her new book, Making Your Voice Heard, uses the research on power and influence to help people speak up to those who have more power than they do. Let's give Jen and Connson a very warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Connson. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you.
Hi, Jen. Nice to be here.
So, as you know, I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And to start, I was hoping you could introduce yourself to the audience in the different ways you show up in the world.
So I guess I didn't join academia, even though I am a professor now. I didn't join academia until I was in my 40s. So I had quite a long career before that. And what I still identify with in my past career is being a management consultant, because I was in management consulting for about 10 years, working in Hong Kong, 5 years as a consultant with Monitor Company, and then 5 years with the Boston Consulting Group as the regional training and development manager. And I still use a lot of the skills that I learned there. And I also identify with being a researcher, even though I'm not doing any of my original research anymore. I started out in the beginning of my academic career, I was doing my own research, and now I'm still interested in other people's research, but now what I really do is I use all of the research across academia and try to become a bridge. And so, I mean, my main role right now is as a teacher and lecturer, but I think one of my biggest roles is to be a bridge between academia and practice, because there's a ton of useful research in academia, but people don't have access to it because it's all hidden in these academic journals, which, I mean, you really wouldn't want to read even if you did have access to them, because they're just horrible. They're really boring. But so that's what I try to do. And that's what I've tried to do in my book, is to like take all of this really interesting research and to make it digestible and accessible for the general public.
That actually segues quite nicely to one of the questions that I had about, it's a little further down further down my question, but I wanted to acknowledge how I love that the book doesn't read like an academic journal at all, and yet it's peppered with all of these different studies from psychology and organizational behavior, and how the book was also really intentionally as much about stories and psychological studies and also real world practice as well, because the book is filled with that. And yeah, I was just wondering, what might you also say to, academics who might want to make their voices heard beyond the walls of academia, because there is a lot of really interesting research, but then it's just, gathering dust in the, in the virtual library of academic journals.
Yeah, I think the problem is that academics are not rewarded for bringing their research to the general public. So academics are rewarded for publishing in academic journals. And it's really, really difficult to do that. Like, you can spend years. I have a couple of publications, and one of them took about 7 years to get it published. We had to keep going back. We kept getting rejected. We had to do another study and another study. And I think the other one took about 5 years. So this is getting published in these top academic journals is a full-time job. And then on top of that, you've got to do some teaching. If you're not going to get rewarded for writing a book, for bringing your research to the general public, you're just not going to have time for it. And so, because I'm now on in a role where I don't need to do my own original research, I see myself as someone who does have time to actually help other people get their research out to the public. And especially because I worked for 16 years before I went into academia, I use that lens. So I basically use that lens to say, is this useful? Is this relevant? What is it that people are actually struggling with? And okay, I haven't been a consultant, or I haven't been outside of academia for about 20 years now, but I think a lot of it is still relevant. And I do a lot of executive teaching, and I hear from executives what's happening in the world. And so I really use that filter to try to make sure what I'm bringing to people is useful.
Nice. I love how your book is also making academics' voices heard in that way.
I guess you could think of it that way, yeah.
Yeah. And obviously, we're talking to a largely Filipino audience here, and Filipinos also take a lot of pride in successful people who can identify a part of themselves as Filipino, or have some affection or affinity with our culture, which I know is also important to you. And I heard that your mother grew up in Manila and graduated from UP, and you have cousins in Manila, and that you actually grew up here part of the time. Could you tell us a bit more about your connection with the Philippines as well?
Yeah, I mean, I feel a pretty strong connection to the Philippines, even though I never really lived there, aside from going there on vacation. My mother, she was born and grew up in Manila. At the age of 30, she went to the United States to study for her master's degree at Cornell University. And she didn't plan to stay, like she was planning to go back to the Philippines. But then she met my dad, and they got married and settled down in the States. But I actually grew up with a Filipina yaya, even in the States, and she taught me how to sing Bahay Kubo, and she also taught me how to play tinikling. And so, the Philippine culture is very much a part of me. And then when I was 14, my dad moved the whole family to Hong Kong. So I went to high school in Hong Kong. I went to the Hong Kong International School in the 1980s. And so every Christmas and New Year, we would go to Manila to visit my grandmother and my cousins and my aunts and uncles. And I still remember the first Christmas in Manila, I saw these huge billboards of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. And I was like, oh, it's a religious holiday. That's right. That's the whole point of Christmas. It was really funny because, in the West, it's not. It's a commercial holiday. And so that was really cool. And then we had midnight mass, and then we had this feast after midnight mass. I've never had that anywhere else, just in the Philippines. And then New Year's, I remember my cousin buying this huge box of fireworks for his kid. And of course, in the States and in Hong Kong, you're not allowed to have fireworks. And I was like, oh my God, is this safe? Wait. And then just everybody, fireworks everywhere. And the air was filled with smoke, like you couldn't even see because there were so many fireworks. But I mean, those are my memories of the Philippines. I haven't been back in like 20 years, but chicken adobo was the first dish that I ever learned how to cook by myself. And my favorite ice cream flavors are ubi and macapuno. So it's still very much a part of my identity, and I hope to go back and visit at some point.
That's great. It makes me identify with you even more. And yeah, I think it really sounds like a lot of your, your childhood and how you were brought up also, I guess, shaped how you see the world, and just and how you were moving around as well from different places, right? And from the US and then to Hong Kong, which is you would say an Asian country, but with a culture that's not quite as Asian as the others.
Yes.
And then you were also like in the UK, where it is a Western country, but you also reference in the book how, what is it? The chart of what the British say, what they mean.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, that's
Yeah.
also like another Western country, but still somehow not quite as upfront as like the US, right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering how all that has really shaped you and influenced your work.
Well, one comment I've got about the book that people like about the book is that it's not very American. I mean, they know that I'm American, that I grew up in the States, but they like the fact that it's not American, that it's really, I'm very aware of the fact that there are many cultures in the world and many ways of communicating. And so there's no one best way. And part of what I teach is cultural differences. And so I have a chapter in the book about cultural differences, because I know in some cultures, it's great to be direct and straightforward, as a lot of Americans are. But in other cultures, it's not. It's rude. It's like, you can't do that. So I really try throughout the book and also in my teaching to be very nuanced, to just recognize that there is no one best way. I think the most important thing is to be sensitive to the context that you're in and to adjust your behavior for that context.
Yeah. I also remember how you had this part in that chapter where you hesitated to teach any sort of cross-cultural management, precisely because it's not one size fits all. And I'm wondering also how that translates to how you teach at LSE, and how I imagine your class is also really diverse. How does that translate in that setting for you?
Well, I think that's what I love about teaching at LSE. So when I used to teach at the Boston Consulting Group in Hong Kong, we had 10 offices across Asia Pacific, and it was a very diverse group of people, which I got used to and I enjoyed. And so going to LSE was really nice, because it is, I think, one of the most international schools in the UK. It's always attracted a very international student body. So to the point where if you have, say, 80 students in a classroom, they probably represent 40 or 50 different nationalities, like seriously diverse. And so I've learned a lot from teaching diverse groups, because I'll present something and then I'll ask, well, what is your experience with this? And my students will tell me, and I'll learn something new. Like, oh, I didn't know that in that culture, that's the way people do things. And I guess as I've become more experienced in teaching, I've become a little bit even more tentative. I used to say, well, this is really important. You should do this or you shouldn't do this. And now I'm like, in some cases, you should do this. In some cases, you shouldn't do this, because I realize it's just, there's so much variation out there.
Yeah. And then I imagine like managing the diversity in that room as well. How do you also make sure that different students' voices are heard in the classroom?
Actually, teaching online has been really helpful. Which, even though I don't like teaching online, but a lot of my lectures are very large. I have 200 students, sometimes 300 students. And oftentimes, if you're in a lecture hall with 200 or 300 students, students hesitate to raise their hand, or I don't see them because there are so many people and I don't notice that their hand is raised.
Mm-hmm.
Doing that kind of lecture online, there's the raise hand function. So I can see not only who's raised their hand, but I can see the order in which they raise their hand. So I can be really fair about calling on the person who raised their hand first. But there's also the chat function.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found is students who might not normally have spoken up in class, actually, they're participating a bit more because they can type something in the chat. And of course, in the lecture hall with 300 people, you're not going to shout out something, but in the chat, it's a lot easier. You can just type it in.
Yeah. And yeah, like COVID has really been such a game changer in that space, and in the workplace as well, and in the home. And so it's really, drastically changed the way we interact with others and show up for work and in meetings. And I'm wondering, like, since we're talking about the impacts of COVID and online teaching, how do you see it affecting perceptions of gender roles and power and influence in the workplace as well?
I think we have to wait before we make that judgment. I think there's been a lot of people talking about how, working from home, it's putting women behind men because women are the ones who are at home taking care of the kids and trying to work. And I think that's true in a lot of jobs, but I also know people where, because their husbands were working from home, now their husbands are actually more involved in taking care of the kids and much more than before. And those husbands, even once we're back to normal, are kind of like, well, I enjoyed that. I kind of like getting to know my kids and helping out at home. And so I think there's the positive side to it, that in some cases it's changing the dynamics, the home dynamics, in a positive way. So I think that in terms of what are the long-term impacts, I think we have to wait and see because we don't know. But in terms of the short-term impacts, I think there are a few things that we should think about when we're working from home. Is we should think about how we can take advantage of the online format. Because the online format, so if you're a woman or a person who's small and has a very quiet voice, when you're in person in a meeting, you might get dominated by the louder people in the room or the bigger people in the room. But if you're in an online format, then we all have the same size video box. So you're not going to get dominated by anyone who's bigger because we all have the same amount of space. And if you have a really good headset, then you can be heard, like you can amplify your voice. And like I said earlier about the raise hand function and the chat function, you could probably be heard more if you use those functions and if if you're active on them, than you would be in an in-person format. So I think as long as we're working from home and using online tools, we need to think about how we use them to our advantage.
Mm. And I actually came across an interesting article that you wrote as well about, how we're changing the way we work because of COVID. And, one of the suggestions that you made to make voices heard in meetings is also assigning a facilitator, using the poll function, and I forgot what the third one was. But in the event that there isn't, like a designated facilitator, right? How would you navigate such situations?
I think I can't remember what the third one was either, but it was probably something like reaching out to people, reaching before or after the meeting, because I think that is really important. We don't have that in an in-person meeting. You have the time when you arrive early and you're chatting with people, and then you walk out the room together. But online meeting, you just show up, you do the meeting, and you leave. So I think it is important to reach out to people before or after. If you don't have a facilitator, I think it's even more important. So if you don't have a facilitator and you know that you're bringing something to the meeting that some people might object to, or you're bringing something to the meeting that is a little bit controversial, I would reach out to individuals before the meeting to say, I'm going to be talking about this at the meeting. Can I just talk to you about your view on this? So that when you bring it to the meeting, it's not such a shock and you don't end up, getting completely derailed.
Right.
And also that way you have a few allies in the meeting.
Yeah.
But if you're not bringing anything controversial and it's just a general meeting, then I would, and say someone's really dominating, or, I would actually send a private message to the chair of the meeting. I mean, there's usually meetings, there is a chair. Maybe they're not facilitating, they're not doing a good job facilitating, but, I would actually send a private message, because you can do that, a direct chat saying,
Yeah.
hey, could you just cut this person off? Or I really want to say something, or, something like that. But someone has to take responsibility for this. And it's,
Right.
I mean, there have been times actually that I've just tried to talk over the other person. And sometimes that works.
Yeah, and I'm just hearing like the use of technology and using the tools that are now available to us that normally probably wouldn't be under regular circumstances.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering, and you share a lot of personal anecdotes in the book, right? And you also speak quite openly about essentially how your husband has done more work at home and become a stay-at-home father when you did your PhD. And I'm wondering how that also impacts power and influence in your home.
So in my home, because my husband is quite a bit younger than me, he's 7 years younger. We actually started dating when he was 22 and I was 30. There are a few months during the year when we actually have an 8-year difference. So he was 22 and I was 30. And I still remember my mother being very traditional, finding this out. And she said, does he know how old you are? I was like, yes, of course. I'm not lying to him. But, now that I'm 55, the age difference is not so, it doesn't matter so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I think because we have that age difference, because I ended up having, I ended up going on to do the master's and the PhD, it was pretty clear once we had kids that I would be the one working full time and earning the money, and he would be the one taking care of the kids. And he was happy to do that. He's always been happy to support me. I think the fun thing was seeing how it affected our daughters, because we have 2 daughters. And when they were really little, when one of them, I think she was about 2 or 3 years old, she was in the bath and she had 2 ducks, the ducks, the rubber ducks that you play with in the bath, right? She had the little duck and the big duck. And she went, here's the baby duck and here's the daddy duck. Because to her, daddy was the one who takes care of babies. And my other daughter, when she was probably about 5 or 6, she said, oh, mommy, I wish I was a boy. It's like, why? She said, so I could stay home all day and take care of everybody. But now they're teenagers. They understand that our family is quite different. But I think it actually helps to have that, to be a bit older than my husband, because it creates a balance. Whereas in general society, there is an imbalance. Like, men hold positions of power more than women. And so if we were both, say, the same age, he might dominate a bit more. But because I'm so much older, it actually makes us more equal in a lot of ways. But yeah, so I think we have an unusual family, but it works.
Well, I'm glad, and we should be normalizing how that's an option that's available to men, and it reminds me actually of Martin and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So
Yeah.
Props to your husband. Okay, so you also share how doing the garden masterclasses helped spur you to write the book, Right. I'm also just wondering what made you decide power and influence were the areas that you wanted to dive into more deeply in your research and your writing.
Well, when I went to do the PhD, what I was actually interested in, what I wrote in my personal statement was that I was interested in studying voice. And employee voice is what they call this speaking up. So people who are junior speaking up to people who are more senior. And this is because, well, I've never felt able to speak up. I mean, my parents were very traditional Asian parents who are like, children should be seen and not heard. You should listen to us. We will tell you exactly what to do with your life. And I was like, but I want to figure it out for myself. And so I never felt like I had much of a voice growing up. And it really was something I struggled with a lot. And then what got me interested in it as a field of study was when I was working at the Boston Consulting Group, and they asked me to create a training program called Upward Management. They wanted me to teach, because I was in Asia. I was based in Hong Kong. So our junior consultants were all locals, like local to all the different Asian countries. But the senior people were Western, which, happens in a lot of multinational organizations. And so the Westerners were saying, hey, we want our junior people to speak up. We want them to argue with us because they're the ones collecting the data. If we say this is what we should do for the client and they've collected data that says, actually, that's not a good idea, we want them to say, that's not a good idea. And so they wanted this pushback. And we called it, at BCG, we called it upward management because you're managing your boss, you're managing up, up the hierarchy. And so I first of all, I was like, really? You want me to teach this? Like, this is a thing? You want this? And then so when I was teaching it, I noticed the reaction from the junior consultants was half of them were like, oh yeah, I get it. Because, a lot of them were educated in the West and they were kind of like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. This is great. The other half were like, are you trying to get me fired? And I was like, no. This is, your bosses told me this is what they want. And they were like, maybe they told you that, but I really don't think that's what they want. And so that resistance got me really interested because I could identify with it, because I would have been scared to do the same thing. And so training them, teaching them, that got me really interested in it. And then when I decided to do the PhD, I was like, is there actual research behind this? And that's how I ended up looking into it. And what I ended up finding, there is no, okay, so I call this upward influence because you're trying to influence people who are higher than you in the hierarchy. There is no actual field of study called upward influence. So I had to look at lots of different things. I had to look at employee voice. I had to look at influence in general. I had to look at leadership because, the leader's behavior will block communication as well. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
So I looked at a lot of different things, and it wasn't great for publishing in academic journals because academic journals want you to be very focused on a specific theory, but it ended up being great for writing the book.
Yay to your contribution to society in this way that gets read by people.
Yes.
Yeah, so as you were writing the book as well, were there any authors or teachers or even students that you drew inspiration from as you were writing it?
One thing I've found throughout life is that I've never had a particular mentor or a particular, oftentimes people talk about having a specific person that you admire and you try to copy them. And I've never found that. And so and in fact, the research on leadership development says that that's good to not try to copy a particular person because you're never going to be that person. And so what I've gotten used to throughout my life is just picking things from different people. Like, I really like that person's study on this, or I really like, and this is even in like my music taste, this is what I end up doing. And I love the fact that there's now Spotify, because when I was growing up, you had to buy a whole album. But now I can like go through the album and pick, actually, I only like this song. And then the other one, I only like this song. But that's essentially the way I think about, you know, what do I find interesting? What do I find useful? Is there's lots of different contributions, small contributions from different people.
Yeah.
There's no particular person or particular, you know, source that I really focused on.
Yeah. I mean, and I think what I'm hearing a lot from you is really, in a way, this bridging and this like connecting things, right? And I think even with your, I don't know, your leader slash author archetype, if you will, it's really just an amalgam of all of these other inspirations that you found in your life. And also, yeah, you keep talking about upward influence as well. And so much of that is really derived from a person's interior life, their self-perception, which you cover in the book. And obviously there's a lot of psychology in it. And one might argue that we cannot simply shift our mindset by reading a book. So what support structures would you say people can create for themselves to really harness their power and influence?
It's a long journey. I think for me, I mean, when I was younger, I was painfully shy. And I'm still an introvert. I like people, but I only like people in small doses and in small groups. Like I love one-to-one conversations, but if I have to walk into a room full of strangers for a cocktail party, I don't want to go there. So I guess for me, when I was 15, just to give you an example of how long this journey has been for me, when I was 15, I still remember we were on vacation and we were in the hotel room, and my mother said, "Can you go down to the reception and ask them for a newspaper?" Because I'm the oldest of three kids, and I was like, "What? You want me to ask a stranger for something?" And I still remember it because I remember how scared I was, terrified to go down to the reception desk to ask them for a newspaper. I was like, how am I going to ask them? What am I going to say? And now at 55, I'm giving lectures to, 200, 300 students. And of course I still get nervous. Like if I didn't get nervous, there'd be something wrong with me. But I can manage that nervousness and I'm fine. So I mean, that's a long journey, right? That's 40 years that I've been on this journey. And I would say it's all been little things, and everyone's journey is going to be different. But there were certain things, like when I was younger, I had a part-time job where I was teaching. Oh no, actually, this was even better. I had another job where I was a tour guide. So when I was in university, I had a job where I was a tour guide. That really helped me kind of speak up, learn to speak up. So that was helpful. And then, of course, doing the job at BCG where I was the trainer, that was really helpful because that I would get feedback after every session, and that really helped me improve very quickly. And then around the age of 50, I heard someone say once that they became 50 and fearless. And I think something shifted for me because at 50, it was really difficult for me. I was like, okay, now I'm going to be closer to death than I am to birth. Like it's, unless I live to be 100, which I don't think I will. I don't know. But so it got me to the point where I was like, well, I'm just going to say it. Like, I don't have time for this. So that also kind of shifted me to find my voice. But really, I think a lot of it was the roles that I held, the jobs that I did, wanting to improve. I did take a few courses where I had to, it was presentation skills courses where I was videotaped and I had to watch myself on videotape. And depending on who you are and what you're dealing with, Working with a coach can be very helpful because a coach is an external person who can actually tell you how to handle the situation. If you're in the situation, it can be very hard to see how to handle it. And so it's really going to be different things for different people. But I mean, hopefully it's not going to take everyone 40 years like it took me. It's, that's the whole purpose of this book, is to help people do it faster. But it is, as you said, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen from just reading a book. The book will give you stuff to practice.
Yeah.
But it's the practice, it's the actually doing it that's going to help you. In fact, I saw something recently where someone who was interested in becoming a comedian found from interviewing all these very experienced comedians that if you don't get up on stage for a few nights, like if you go for a few nights without getting up on stage, it affects your delivery. So I'm not saying that you need to like do public speaking every day, but you do need to practice. Like that's even the professionals. If I don't lecture for a year, I'm going to stumble. So I have to keep lecturing on a regular basis in order to keep it up.
Yeah. So really for me, like what I'm hearing as well is really the practice. It's like building that vocal muscle to make yourself heard. And yeah, so yeah, thanks for also like giving us so many different practices that we can try out in the book. And I'm also wondering, what's next for Connson at this point? What else do you have up your sleeve?
I actually don't know. I think right now I'm very much focused on, because this book is sort of the culmination of essentially my life's work. It's like my whole journey from someone who was really shy to someone who is now making my voice heard. And so everything in there are lots of stories about me and my life and my experiences. It's not just one of many books. It's like, it's a very personal book for me.
Yeah, it reads that way.
Yeah. So I don't know what next. I think I'm gonna sit with this for a while and promote this for a while and try to get it out. Like all my students who have read it said it's been really useful. So I just want to get the word out there so that it helps more people.
I was also wondering if you've also done any work with like social movements or advocacy groups, that sort of thing, because you talk a lot about in the workplace, organizations in the book, and I'm wondering if advocacy campaigning has come up as well.
Well, I do teach, I do some teaching for the United Nations Staff College. I do some teaching, I try to get out there and try to help people learn, like I do a bit of work with the WHO, and I try to help people learn these skills on an individual level. Advocacy groups, however, that's a different kind of voice. And I don't know much about that. So I'm not sure like how to help, say, an advocacy group get heard better, because that's very different from the one-to-one communication that I'm talking about. But I think I think if I help the individuals who are in those organizations, that can help.
Yeah. And because I think for a lot of advocacy work, there still is a lot of these one-to-one conversations, small group conversations that need to be had. It's not just all in the public domain, in the news, or like big protests or whatnot. So I think that the book does lend itself to teaching a lot of useful skills even for that particular group.
Although there is one thing I should say about that, because I remember reading, it was an interview with an activist in the US, and he said, if all the people who went to a protest donated $5 to a fund to pay for a lobbyist, to have an office in Washington, D.C., to lobby Washington, to lobby the government for their cause, that would have far more effect than being out on the streets protesting. And that's always stuck with me, because I really think this is what we need to think about. If we're going to create social change, we have to think about what is the most powerful way? What is the lever that we need?
Yeah.
How do we make that change? What is the change we're trying to create? Simply forwarding someone else's tweet is not necessarily going to create that change. Who are the people in power and how do we get to them? And I think that's really what we need to think about.
Maybe there's room for another book yet.
Yeah, maybe.
That would be very interesting. I would buy that book. And finally, sorry, Ariel, I'm not sure if I'm super railroading on your time, but I do have one final question, and you can choose between two, I guess. So what is the one most important lesson that you'd want your students or readers of this book to take away? Or you could answer both. Sorry, I couldn't decide on which I wanted as my final question. Or what advice would you give 15-year-old Connson?
Okay, so I'll start with the advice for 15-year-old Connson, which is that you should be patient with yourself and not so hypercritical. Because I think that's part of the problem for a lot of people who stifle their own voice, is they are their own worst critic. And so just be more gentle with yourself and be more patient with yourself, and over time you will improve. The biggest lesson I would say to take away, I mean, there are a lot of big lessons, but one of the things I think we misunderstand about influence and about making your voice heard is we often forget it's a two-way street. So when we think about making our voice heard, we often think about, okay, how do I get louder? How do I make my message more interesting? But if we're talking about a one-to-one conversation, if we're talking about talking to someone in power, you need to understand that person as well. So really, the best conversations I've had when I'm trying to influence someone is when I start by asking them, what's your perspective on this situation? And where are you coming from? And once I understand them, then it's much easier for me to also be heard. So I think really thinking of influence as a two-way street, and an essential part of it is understanding the other person and being open to their point of view and being compassionate. Because otherwise, if your goal is simply to make my voice heard and nobody else's voice gets to be heard, that's not a good goal, and that's not what I would want the book to be used for.
This was so great, and I'm so happy that that's what you said, because that's exactly what I took away from the book, and that making our voices heard, we need to be able to hear and deeply listen to other people's voices as well. So thank you so much, and for all the nuance as well in the book about gender and culture. I love those chapters the most. And everyone who's watching this, you can totally purchase Connson's book from Fully Booked. And I think at this point, just thank you so much, Connson, for your time. I will turn the floor over to Ariel.
Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Jen and Connson. It was such a treat to listen to you both. And I'm just so inspired. And I hope everyone who is watching this conversation feels the same way. So Making Your Voice Heard is available at Fully Booked branches and online through Shopee, Lazada, and fullybookedonline.com. So please purchase your copies through those avenues. And thank you, everyone. Take care.